And then America is also on the brink of civil war. Like next year when the Democrats take over the House, it's just going to be complete political chaos because the Democrats are going to impeach Trump, and then you're going to have a lot of like possible political assassinations. What happened this week in Washington D.C. when two National Guardsmen were shot? That could be happening a lot, and this would force a surveillance state throughout the country, which would force popular backlash. So these Western nations are going to face a lot of turmoil and political convulsions over the next 5 years. So I mean like that, I think is just a political outlook, and that's why I think for a lot of nations, for a lot of investors, Pax Judaica makes the most sense. Look, the reality is that if you're Russia, your enemy is the United States, your enemy is the American Empire. Pax Judaica replaces the American Empire. In fact, Pax Judaica would accelerate the demise of the American Empire because the American Empire is now being propped up by transnational capital. It's a Ponzi scheme, right? Well, if you're transnational capital, you're kind of sick of financing this Ponzi scheme. So if a better investment opportunity arises in Pax Judaica, the money transfers over there, and then America is allowed to implode. That $38 trillion, they can just default on, right? So I think that's a state of play. I think that transnational capital wants an implosion of the American Empire and have Pax Judaica replace it. And then if you're Russia, of course you would want that. If you're Iran, actually, you prefer that as well to the Pax Americana, because look, I mean, if you just read the Bible, the Jewish people have always thought highly of the Persian people. Cyrus the Great was the Jewish Messiah. And it was the Persians who allowed the Jews to return from the Babylonian captivity to rebuild their second temple. So historically, the Jews and the Persians have gotten along very well. And I think that once America is out of the equation, then Iran and Israel could come to negotiating table and negotiate a everlasting peace. But the trick is, how do you get America out of that region? And I would bet that they could possibly engineer a war between America and Iran, so that America loses this war and Iran is hobbled and it's not in a position to challenge Judaica. Certainly from an Israeli perspective, that's the best case scenario.
Interesting. Is Venezuela at all connected to this? South America at all connected to this? Or is that its own kind of realm?
I have actually no idea what's happening in Venezuela, but I will say this. I think it's very, very unlikely that Trump will initiate a military confrontation with Venezuela. I don't think Trump's that sort of personality. And if you just look at it from a geopolitical, game theory, military perspective, it actually makes no sense to strike at Venezuela. All right, let's just say you conduct a couple of airstrikes. What do you get from that? Because all you do is you basically embolden the regime, you unify the people behind Maduro, and also you antagonize the entire Latin American, Caribbean region against you, right? Cuba, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, they're more emboldened. The entire South America region would think that America is on a imperialist project. And so you benefit not at all from striking Venezuela. Regime change is not possible because America doesn't have the ground troops to force a regime change. And Venezuela is a mountainous region, and Americans are not good at fighting, again, in mountains. They're good at fighting in deserts because of their air power. But mountains would be guerrilla warfare, and you would see a lot of American casualties, and therefore you would see a popular political revolt in America. There would be no support for a strike in Venezuela. So I think the best explanation for what's happening in Venezuela is posturing. I think Trump is trying to negotiate a deal with Maduro. Why? Because if America goes to war with Iran, then America needs to secure another supply of oil because the Middle East is, on fire, and Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. So I think that Trump is trying to negotiate a deal with Maduro, and I think a lot of it is just posturing. And this fits into Trump's character, because if you just read Art of the Deal, that's just how he negotiates. Like the first thing you do is pretend you're guerrilla and threaten the counterparty, and then you calm down and slowly, reach a deal. But for Trump, what's really important is posturing. I think that in geopolitics, there's an implicit, unwritten rule, which is the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, that's American territory. If you try to intervene in the Western Hemisphere, if you're China or Europe or Russia, that's an act of war. And, we've had this ever since the Monroe Doctrine. So I think that great powers understand about this unwritten rule. So, Russia and China may provide some support, but they will not intervene militarily against the United States because that would be an act of war.
Could they have armed Venezuela with their weaponry?
Right. I mean, we see news reports of the Wagner Group flying to Venezuela. We see Russian generals flying to Venezuela, but it's not enough to stop a American invasion, right? I mean, so I think it's more to bolster the confidence of Maduro, to show his people that China and Russia and Iran are standing behind Maduro. So it's a vote of confidence on Maduro. There's also a veiled threat in that, if Maduro, you sell us out, if you backstab us, then, some bad things might happen to you. Maduro's security detail is Cuban, and Cuba would lose a lot if Maduro were to sign a deal with Trump, right? If Venezuela would to fall into the American sphere of influence. So it's a very complicated negotiation process.
Is Cuba next?
So I think what's happening is, okay, first of all, it's posturing, right? So, if America does attack Venezuela, it's going to cause, a chain of events that is basically unpredictable. So it's possible Cuba is next. But I don't think it'll go to that. I think what's happening is there are a lot of things we don't know that's going on behind the scenes. So one thing that I theorize about is there a deep state conflict going in Washington that we don't know, right? So because Trump talks about going after these Mexican cartels. Well, who finances these Mexican cartels? Who runs these Mexican cartels? It's the CIA. Yep. Yeah, everyone knows the CIA is the world's biggest drug runner, right? I mean, people say, well, they run these drugs, they do this human trafficking in order to finance their shadow ops. No, I would say they do the shadow ops in order to justify their human trafficking, drug running operations. The CIA is the world's biggest criminal empire. So if you're Trump, right, and you want a third term, and I think that's a goal here for Trump to secure a third term. Who's your biggest enemy? It's the CIA. And if you're Trump, you think it's the CIA that sabotaged the 2000 elections. It's the CIA, the deep state, that cheated on behalf of Biden. So you need to neutralize this particular deep state actor if you are to have a third term. Otherwise, they'll just rig the election in 2028 as they did in 2020, right? So, and how do you do that? Well, you attack their sources of funding. You attack their drug running operations. And so maybe that entire fleet in the Caribbean, it's meant to threaten not just the CIA, okay? Because remember, the CIA is also backed by the City of London. Because the CIA, yeah, they run the drugs, but it's the City of London that funnels, that launders the money for the CIA, right? I think that for Trump, he has a clear vision, and it's the American empire, right? So as America retreats from the Middle East, as America retreats from the Asia Pacific, it needs new supply chains, it needs new resources, it needs new vassals. And it makes sense to colonize Canada. It makes sense to colonize Mexico, right? Canada has all this wealth and resources that the Canadians aren't using. Mexico has this burgeoning working population that America will need to fight to basically as a labor supply, right? So Trump is very serious about eventually taking over Greenland, Canada, and Mexico. And how do we know that people aren't working behind the scenes to make this happen already? Mark Carney, he's not a Canadian prime minister. He's first and foremost an agent of transnational capital. Remember that this guy used to work for Goldman Sachs. Then he went to Bank of Canada first, okay? Then he went to Bank of England. And he was the first and only foreign citizen to be governor of the Bank of England. How does that happen, right? So Mark Carney is clearly an agent of transnational capital. The other thing I would say about Mark Carney is, no one talks about this, but he spent most of his adult life outside of Canada, right? And why didn't Canadians complain? And then that election was just silly because the Liberals should have been trounced, but Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative candidate, he just imploded. He basically said, I quit, okay? He didn't really try, and he gave it to Mark Carney. So why would he do that? Well, the reason why he would do that is because they're all paid actors. It's all one big theatrical stage for us peasants. And Mark Carney is clearly an agent of transnational capital. And I bet you that maybe people are working behind the scenes to pick up Canada, right? Because Alberta has talked about secession. So I think eventually America will colonize Canada they'll need to break it up first, and then these different provinces will slowly be absorbed into America. I think that Alberta will probably be the first.
So you think Mark Carney is working with the Americans and Trump in this case, or is that an over?
Yeah, listen. Carney was way behind the polls. Then Trump starts to threaten Canada, right? And then Carney shoots up in the polls because Carney is going to set up to Trump. And Canadians are like, Mark Carney knows the British. He knows the King of England. Therefore, he could save us from Trump. But if you do some basic internet research, you will know that Carney and Trump go way back. Okay, so yeah, I mean, like
what's their history? What's their history together, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I mean, the reality is, if you just look at the elite of Canada and America, there aren't that many, and they're all like buddies. They go to the same country clubs, their kids go to the same schools. So I think I don't remember the details, but I think Mark Carney was an investor in some of Trump's ventures. So they go back. Yeah, but if you just do some online research about Trump and Carney, they have a pretty strong relationship. And again, if Trump just kept his mouth shut, okay, Carney would have lost. So why did Trump speak up, right, and said, I'm going to go invade Canada and we'll take over Canada, right? And he kept at it. Yeah. So the thing is that America has no peer competitors, but Russia has a peer competitor. It's called Germany, right? Mm-hmm. So what's happening is that Germany is going under massive, rapid militarization, okay? And then Germany is very serious about this, right? So Russia has to deal with Germany at some point. Now, China has to deal with Japan at some point, okay? So in this retreat, America will ensure that Germany and Japan can be the regional hegemon, if you will, right? So America will support Israel, and then Germany and Japan. And that's a game, and that's a play. Because when you retreat, where do your military assets go? Right? Your bases, your technology, all that infrastructure you build up, where does it go? And Germany has US military bases. And so America thinks that it can still exert hegemony in Europe through its proxy Germany. Same in the East Asia, right? America will try to exert hegemony in East Asia through Japan and South Korea. So that's why I don't think that there'll be a hegemon that will emerge in Europe and in East Asia, because America will try to maintain as much conflict in these regions as possible. And America will try to maintain its hegemony by being the power broker in these conflicts, by pretending to be the peacemaker. And that I think is their strategy. The first thing that doesn't make any sense is America's war on terror. Yes, I understand that America was attacked on 9/11. I understand that. But why did they have to go attack Libya and Iraq and all these other places that have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, okay? And the answer is they're trying to create something called the Greater Israel Project. They're trying to have Israel become Pax Judaica, the grand power in the Middle East, because that's important in all secret societies. Israel must become the dominant power in the Middle East, okay? So this helps us understand why the war of terror happened the way it did. That's number one. Number two is, right now, America is threatening to attack Iran. Why would they do that? Because in order for Pax Judaica to come into being, Iran must be taken out of the equation. Iran must be destroyed. Then, if that were to happen, there'll be no challenger to the power of Pax Judaica, okay? Does that make sense? All right. The third thing is Silicon Valley and AI. So right now you have AI, ChatGPT, which doesn't really do anything, okay? It makes cool images on your computer and helps you cheat in school, okay? That's about it. Doesn't really do anything else. And if you don't go to school, then you're like, why am I using ChatGPT, okay? And you're not gonna pay a lot of money for it. So AI, it's a dead end. But at the same time, all around the world, everyone's spending billions, trillions of dollars on data centers, right? So everyone's putting money into AI. But then you're like, well, how can you make money off that? If you think the answer is for you to use AI, well, it's hard to make money off that. But if the answer is to create an AI surveillance state, that makes a lot more sense, right? So what is a surveillance state? Very easy, guys. We have it in China, okay? It's digital ID and digital currency. And the idea is that everything you buy, everything you do will be tracked. And so they can create a profile on you. This profile will tell the government who you are, how you behave, what you think. Not only that, the government can also manipulate how you think, how you behave, Okay? And this is, of course, called the mark of the beast, right? And so that's what Pax Judaica is. Pax Judaica is a global AI surveillance system. Okay? It also helps us explain immigration in Europe, okay? Because the war on terror, you've sent these millions of refugees from Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq into Europe, which is causing a lot of conflict in Europe. Why would that happen? Well, for Pax Judaica to come into being, you need to destroy the world, okay? So I'm not saying this is true, but I'm saying that if the goal is Pax Judaica, it does help us connect the dots. It helps us explain why things are happening the way they are, okay? Also, the last thing is anti-Semitism, okay? So you may have noticed, if you're online, people don't like the Jews. And this is like out of nowhere. After October 7th, you have anti-Semitism over the internet. Now, I have criticized Israel before, okay? But anti-Semitism is not the same thing as anti-Zionism, right? Zionism is the belief that Israel is a chosen people and the promised land and all that, okay? But Judaism as religion, it's perfectly fine. So why would people not care about the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, okay? And you can argue it's all purposeful because remember, the part of the plan is to force the Jews to return to Israel. That's very important for this plan to work out, okay? It's key. That's why you are seeing so much anti-Semitism around the world today, okay? And the last thing, of course, and this is something we'll discuss, is something called the red heifers. So red heifers are red cows that are perfectly genetically modified. And you need the red heifers you have to sacrifice the red heifers to purify the ground in order to reconstruct the Solomon's temple, okay? And guess what? They've already sacrificed the red heifers. So it seems as though everything is in place, all right? They're moving towards Pax Judaica. All right, so let's discuss what will happen in the short term and in the long term if Pax Judaica really is the end goal, okay? So when you have Israel fighting wars everywhere, okay? The main enemy right now is Iran. In Europe, you have the Europeans about to go to war with Russia in Ukraine. America right now is threatening to attack Venezuela, okay? South America. You have 10% of the US Navy in the Caribbean, and they're about to attack Venezuela. You have China and Japan at conflict. You have India here, and you have Africa, okay? So what's gonna happen in the short term? Okay, well, what we know is that Europe is planning to go to war with Russia, okay? Europe is about to go to war with Russia, okay? At the same time, you have a lot of immigrants in Europe. And this is gonna create civil wars in Europe. Okay, civil war. So you have both war with Russia as well as civil war. So Europe is kind of screwed, okay? America has the same situation where the left-right divide is so polarized that eventually they'll go to war. If you read the news, you may have heard about the shootings at Brown University, as well as this MIT physicist who were shot, okay? So random violence will be more and more common in the United States. And you can argue that it's all deliberate because the idea is this. Let's just say you have a jar. You put red ants in the jar and black ants in a jar. They get along fine. But you take the jar and you just shake it up, and now they're at war with each other, okay? That's what's happening where the left and right, they really don't like each other. They don't talk to each other, and they refuse to engage in debate with each other. But they're not gonna fight each other unless there's violence, in which case, their tribal mentality takes over and they start killing each other, okay? So we're gonna expect civil war in the United States. Then you're gonna have the Americans start to attack Venezuela and possibly other countries in South America. So America is in for a bad time, okay? China, yeah, I mean, Japan and China and India, they're all gonna have conflicts with each other. But also what we should expect is that America starts to embargo China. Meaning America uses its sea power to block China from accessing resources from overseas. And China imports most of its oil and a lot of its food. So if there's a blockade of China, you can expect the Chinese economy to really suffer, okay? All right, and then what we can expect to happen is America at some point will go to war with Iran. and this will destroy both countries. Okay? Iran will not lose this war, but it won't win this war either, because America is just going to bomb the crap out of Iran. It's just going to send Iran back decades. But America will lose this war, but this is important because if America loses this war, it's forced out of the Middle East. And once it's forced out of the Middle East, all its military assets goes to Israel, which creates the Pax Judaica. Does that make sense, guys? That's the plan. Okay, now you have Pax Judaica. And what Pax Judaica will do is start to control the world. Because through chaos and conflict, Pax Judaica can make a lot of money, right? Because Pax Judaica, what's going to happen is that you have these technology companies like Google, they're going to move over to Pax Judaica and build a global surveillance state. You have civil wars, you need AI to control people. If you're going to war with Russia, you need weapons, but you also need financing as well. So you can expect a lot of banks to move to Israel, and it's possible Israel becomes now the global reserve currency because everyone is trading with Israel. If you're Russia, you need to trade with, you need to trade your resources, right? Oil, energy, and grain, okay? So Russia controls a third of the world's carbohydrates. Guess what, guys? Israel controls Africa. So what will happen is that Russia and other countries will sign a trade agreement with Israel, and Israel becomes the center of global trade, okay? Does that make sense? So this is how Pax Judaica will profit. And remember that Israel has the world's best intelligence agency, the Mossad. And what they can do is go around the world and create as much chaos as possible. Okay? So while the world is burning, Israel is profiting. And that's what the future looks like for the next 10, 20 years. And this will, of course, lead to the rise of the Antichrist, who will take control of Pax Judaica and force the world to eventually attack Israel in something called the War of Gog and Magog. And this will, of course, lead to the second coming of Jesus. So that's a grand plan, okay? All right? Any questions? Does it make sense to you guys? I know it's evil, and you know what? I could be a complete idiot, okay? I could just making all this up. But you have to ask yourself 3 questions. Does it connect the past? Does it explain what's happened in the past? Does it explain what's happening today? And will these things happen in the future, okay? So we haven't lived through the future yet, but you can see the trends.